Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we are diving into one of the most fascinating and complex economic stories unfolding in the world right now, and that is how Ukraine, despite being a smaller country compared to Russia, is managing to push Russia's economy toward the brink of collapse. This is not just a matter of warfare on the battlefield, but also a war of resources, sanctions, trade disruptions, energy markets, and global alliances. The story of how Ukraine has used its resilience and the support of the international community to strain Russia's economy is worth breaking down in detail. When Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, many expected that Ukraine would be overwhelmed quickly. Russia had one of the largest militaries in the world, enormous reserves of oil and gas, and a sense of economic security because of its natural resource exports. Ukraine, on the other hand, seemed vulnerable, but what followed surprised the world. Instead of collapsing, Ukraine stood firm, and the West rallied around it with unprecedented levels of support. That support came not only in the form of military aid, but also in sanctions designed to weaken Russia's economic strength. Sanctions became one of the most powerful tools in Ukraine's arsenal, even though they were technically imposed by Western allies. Ukraine's resilience and diplomacy ensured that these sanctions were both severe and sustained. Russia was cut off from much of the global financial system, with major banks being banned from using SWIFT, the international payment messaging system. This made it incredibly difficult for Russia to conduct normal trade and finance operations. Even though Russia tried to find alternatives through China and other partners, the disruption to global transactions was immediate and profound. Another area where Ukraine managed to squeeze Russia's economy was in the energy sector. Before the war, Russia was one of the world's biggest exporters of oil and natural gas. Europe, in particular, was heavily dependent on Russian gas pipelines. Ukraine's resistance and ability to disrupt Russian control forced Europe to look for alternatives, cutting a lifeline that had long fueled Russia's treasury. The sabotage of pipelines, reductions in purchases, and the transition to liquefied natural gas imports from other regions meant Russia suddenly had fewer buyers for its most lucrative exports. The drop in revenue hit hard, especially when combined with the price caps imposed on Russian oil. Ukraine also leveraged the battlefield itself to hurt Russia's economy. By targeting Russian supply lines, depots, and even hitting symbolic economic assets like oil depots and bridges, Ukraine made it much more expensive for Russia to continue its war effort. Every destroyed tank, lost missile, and disrupted logistics chain translates into billions in costs for the Russian economy. The longer the war drags on, the more money Russia is forced to pour into sustaining it, and this drains funds that could have gone into domestic development. One of the most underestimated aspects of this conflict has been Ukraine's ability to weaponize global opinion. Through powerful communication, diplomacy, and leadership, Ukraine convinced much of the democratic world that helping Ukraine was not just charity, but a matter of global security. This led to sanctions, divestments, and a boycott of Russian goods and services by thousands of companies. Major international corporations pulled out of Russia, shutting down operations that employed millions and provided billions in tax revenue. From McDonald's to major energy giants, the exodus of foreign investment created both economic stagnation and a brain drain as educated Russians left the country. At the same time, Ukraine positioned itself as a symbol of resistance and resilience. This meant it received continuous financial support from allies in the form of loans, grants, and direct budgetary assistance. For Russia, this meant the war would not bankrupt Ukraine as quickly as expected, but instead it would prolong Russia's own financial bleeding. Ukraine essentially turned the tables, making the war a costly burden on Russia rather than a short-term conquest. Russia tried to resist these pressures by leaning on its vast reserves of gold and foreign currency. In the beginning, it had over $600 billion in reserves, but because of sanctions, nearly half of these reserves were frozen abroad. That was a devastating blow. Russia could not easily access its own money to stabilize the ruble or fund imports. The currency plunged, inflation rose, and while Russia claimed it was adapting, the cracks in the system became more visible over time. Ukraine also influenced global food markets to put additional pressure on Russia. Both countries are major grain exporters, but when Russia tried to use food exports as leverage by blocking Ukrainian ports, Ukraine pushed back by creating alternative supply routes through Europe. The world rallied again, accusing Russia of weaponizing hunger. This undermined Russia's diplomatic position, making it harder for Moscow to attract new economic partners in the global south. Meanwhile, Ukraine's persistence in keeping exports flowing helped stabilize food supplies and won more allies. The war of technology has been another major battlefield where Ukraine has indirectly strained Russia's economy. With Western backing, Ukraine ensured that advanced technologies such as semiconductors, precision tools, and electronics were kept out of Russia's reach. These items are essential for modern weapons production, aircraft maintenance, and energy infrastructure. Without access to them, Russia has been forced to turn to outdated systems or rely on smuggling through third parties. This technological strangulation slows Russia's development and makes its economy more backward-looking, which over time reduces competitiveness. Ukraine's ability to keep Russia isolated economically also comes from its clever diplomatic moves. It has strengthened ties not only with NATO and the European Union, but also with countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. By positioning itself as a victim of aggression and a defender of international law, Ukraine made it costly for many governments to openly side with Russia. The fewer partners Russia has, the harder it is for it to replace lost Western markets. Even China and India, while buying Russian oil, have been able to dictate lower prices, exploiting Russia's weakened bargaining position. This creates a cycle where Russia sells more but earns less. Another key factor is the demographic and social impact of the war on Russia. Hundreds of thousands of educated young Russians fled the country to avoid conscription or repression. This brain drain means Russia loses some of its best talent, entrepreneurs, and innovators. Ukraine's resilience indirectly accelerated this exodus by making the war long and costly. A shrinking, less skilled workforce weakens economic productivity, which further accelerates decline. The longer the war continues, the more international investors avoid Russia. Even neutral or friendly countries are wary of being caught in secondary sanctions. Ukraine's persistence ensures that the war is not seen as a frozen conflict, but as an ongoing crisis, which keeps businesses and banks away from Moscow. Without foreign investment, Russia struggles to modernize industries, build infrastructure, or sustain long-term growth. Ukraine's defense of its sovereignty also created a situation where Russia is forced to overspend on the military. Military budgets are now consuming enormous portions of Russia's GDP. This is money taken away from healthcare, education, and domestic programs, creating long-term instability. Ukraine is effectively forcing Russia into a war economy where guns replace butter. Historically, war economies are unsustainable unless they end in quick victory. For Russia, this endless drain is one of the clearest paths toward collapse. Another economic consequence comes from the reputational damage Russia has suffered. Ukraine's diplomacy and storytelling have made Russia a pariah in much of the world. Investors, tourists, students, and even athletes find Russia less welcoming. Its global soft power has shrunk, and with it, economic opportunities. Countries under sanctions tend to face hidden costs, such as higher borrowing rates, increased smuggling fees, and inefficiencies in trade. Ukraine's endurance has ensured that Russia cannot escape these hidden costs anytime soon. As Russia loses ground economically, Ukraine gains leverage in negotiations. Every month of continued resistance means Russia pays more in money, resources, and reputation. Ukraine has successfully turned time into a weapon. Instead of collapsing under the pressure, it has forced Russia into a prolonged economic quagmire. This is a remarkable achievement for a country with far fewer resources at the start. The global economy has also played a role in reinforcing Ukraine's pressure on Russia. By aligning with Europe's green energy transition, Ukraine indirectly helps reduce demand for Russian fossil fuels. The faster Europe builds renewable energy capacity, the less it needs Russian oil and gas. Ukraine's insistence on holding out pushed Europe to accelerate these plans, which will permanently reduce Russia's influence over the continent. Once lost, these energy markets will not return easily. Ukraine's counteroffensives and successes on the battlefield also have psychological economic effects. Every time Ukraine regains territory or pushes Russian forces back, investors and analysts see Russia as weaker. This reduces confidence in the ruble, drives capital flight, and makes ordinary Russians question the future. Economic collapse is not only about numbers, but also about perception. Ukraine has managed to shift global and domestic perception in ways that deepen Russia's crisis. Meanwhile, Ukraine has received major pledges of reconstruction aid from its allies, ensuring that once the war ends, it will have billions ready for rebuilding. Russia, on the other hand, faces the opposite. It will likely have to pay reparations, face prolonged sanctions, and struggle with a decimated economy. By holding out, Ukraine ensures that the long-term future looks brighter for itself and darker for its opponent. The dynamic of technology sanctions continues to play a critical role. Without Western microchips and aerospace parts, Russia's industries are increasingly outdated. Ukraine's diplomatic press